Lancelot, the Knight of the Lake, the greatest of the Round Table Knights, and Mash's estranged dad. But what about the Lancelot of Fate Grand Order? How well does he compare to his mythical counterpart, and what grade would I give his depiction? Let's do this. Lancelot is both a Saber and Berserker class servant, which, well, there's a fair bit to say about this. Not because Lancelot doesn't qualify for these two classes, he does, but because he has the potential to be even more than that. Lancelot is widely regarded as the greatest of the Round Table Knights, with a particular emphasis on his skill as a combatant. Let's go through these real quick. Saber is an easy one for Lancelot to qualify for. He wields not only erudite, but other swords as well, depending upon the story. But Lancelot is also regularly depicted as taking part in jousting tournaments, often hiding his identity when he does. And since jousts tend to feature both horses and lances, well, there's Lancer and Rider right there. We don't get Lancelot as either of these classes, though his Saber version does have the riding skill. Now, what about Berserker? In this class, Lancelot is actually only the second Berserker in the entire franchise, making his first appearance in Fate Zero. Actually, he's the first servant originating in Fate Zero that I'm covering. Hooray! Anyway, why is he a Berserker? Well, to put it bluntly, the man is prone to bouts of madness, especially when in combat. Going all the way back to some of his earliest appearances in Arthurian legend, Lancelot is described as brave, handsome, and many other positive traits. But when the action starts or he loses himself to anger, he goes nuts, with all those good qualities being overtaken by a mad rage. He shrugged off any wounds that he would take, and anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby who wasn't clearly an ally, there was a good chance that person would end up dead. This is one of Lancelot's more notable character flaws, that behind the appearance of being the best of the Round Table Knights, something dark lurks underneath. We will be revisiting this darkness many times throughout this video. Getting into his character design, I'm actually going to start with Berserker Lancelot because his was the first version of the character created in the franchise. Lancelot here is dressed up in dark blue plate armor, though it is sometimes described as being black. In his first ascension, he is also shrouded by that black fog stuff. Now, that is actually one of Lancelot's noble phantasms, for someone's glory. I'll be talking more about that later. For a second ascension, the mist goes away, though now he's picked up that lamppost he used as a weapon in Fate Zero. Lastly, in his third ascension, he does away with the lamppost and is now wielding erudite, though it remains darkened like the rest of his armor. Much of Zerkerlot's design is about obscuring his true identity, which, again, is part of that MP that I'll talk about later. But, as a teaser, Lancelot keeping his true identity hidden is something that he did quite often in Arthurian legend, and so is consistent with his lore. Saber Lancelot, by contrast, doesn't try to hide his identity, with his armor looking much more ornate and fancy than in his Berserker form, though it is still the same armor. He certainly looks the part of a knight, especially once you get into his second and third ascension when his armor shifts from that dark bluish purple to white. This is clearly meant to represent Lancelot in his prime. Notably, he also has much shorter hair than his Berserker counterpart, though you only actually see what's underneath Zerkerlot's helmet very briefly. As for why that is, apparently the illustrator was told to make Lancelot, and I quote, with a feeling of a Yankee who repents and cut off his hair. I don't know if something was lost in translation, but I have no idea what this is supposed to mean. Maybe I'm just dumb. Regardless, does Lancelot look like a noble and formidable knight? Yes, he does. I'll call this a solid design for both versions of the character. Starting with his Saber version skill set, Lancelot's first skill is Knight of the Lake, which gives him some MP charge and critical stars. Knight of the Lake is the title that Lancelot was given due to him being raised by the Lady of the Lake, and this skill gives Lancelot significant benefits because of that connection. It allows him to temporarily boost his own stats as he wishes, since he is under the constant protection of Vivienne, his adopted mother. Also, Vivienne did give Lancelot a number of items when he left her realm to venture into the real world, so this skill could also be representing that. Either way, this is a solid skill. Saberlot's second skill is Eternal Arms Mastery, which increases his star gather rate by an absolutely insane 6,000% for 3 turns. Now, I've already discussed Lancelot being multi-talented in combat when talking about how many classes he might qualify for, and this is the skill meant to represent that. Notably, it is a talent for combat that surpasses whatever issues one might have, including the madness that afflicts his Berserker counterpart. Is Lancelot consistently portrayed as a skilled combatant, even when he gets overtaken by a Berserker-like frenzy? Yes, he absolutely is. Saber Lancelot's third skill is Knight of Owner, which grants critical stars per turn for 3 turns, as well as increasing his critical strength for 3 turns. Now, I have quite a bit to say about this skill, but for now, I'm going to hold off because Knight of Owner is also the MP of Berserker Lancelot, and so I'll be talking about this later. Shifting to his Berserker form, Lancelot's first skill is Eternal Arms Mastery, which does exactly the same thing as the skill from his Saber counterpart. I've got nothing more to add. Zerkerlot's second skill is Protection of the Spirits, which increases his star drop rate for 3 turns. Now, it says spirits in the skill name, but this is actually referring to fairies and elementals. Those who have this skill, Lancelot and Gawain, have their luck increased when they enter combat. Basically, this is Berserker Lancelot's version of the skill Knight of the Lake that his Saber version has, though it only boosts luck rather than other stats. With that said, a boost to his luck? Considering how skilled the guy is in combat, does he even need that? Well, it can't hurt, I suppose. Lastly, Berserker Lancelot's third skill is Mana Reversal, which increases his MP gain for a turn, as well as increasing his critical strength for 3 turns. There is little to nothing about this skill. In the FGO materials, they don't even have an entry for this skill. I've heard some things about how this is a skill that lets him absorb mana from his surroundings, or that it is another component of Zerkerlot's MP, but because of the lack of official information, these are just guesses. I'm just going to set this skill aside. Saber Lancelot's noble phantasm is Arendite Overload, whereupon he channels power into his sword, leaps forth, and then cuts into the enemy, which oddly sounds like a buzzsaw. This MP increases Arts Card effectiveness for a turn before damage, does major damage to a single enemy, and then decreases that enemy's defenses depending upon overcharge. Arendite is a sword wielded by Lancelot, given to him by the Lady of the Lake when he first set out into the world. As you might expect, considering who gave it to him, Arendite is said to be blessed by fairies, though what exactly that entails isn't entirely clear. But Arendite is not the only sword associated with Lancelot. Before Arendite appeared in stories, Lancelot wielded a sword called Sikis, which, well, now it's the pistol that Summer Artoria Alter has. Now, to be fair, Sikis is said to have originally belonged to Arthur, but don't ask me why it's a pistol now, I have no idea. In his novels on Arthurian legend, T.H. White called Lancelot's sword Joyeux, similar to the name of his castle, Joyeuse Garde, and not to be confused with Joyeuse, the sword wielded by Charlemagne. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Arendite works for Lancelot's MP, but there are other options for him. Berserker Lancelot's noble phantasm is Knight of Owner, whereupon he leaps onto an F-15 fighter jet, has it fire some missiles, and then uses the plane's rotary cannon to shoot all nearby enemies. This MP increases his attack for 3 turns depending upon overcharge, and then does heavy damage to all enemies. This skill is kind of an extension of the skill Eternal Arms Mastery, giving Lancelot the ability to wield any weapon, even other servant MPs, and to do so with his usual skill. The imagery of the MP is an obvious reference to that famous scene in Fate Zero when Lancelot fights Gilgamesh. But how lore accurate is this? Is Lancelot truly someone who can just fight with whatever he has available? I think the best way to answer that question would be to tell a story. Near the end of Mallory's version of Arthurian legend, Agravain, Mordred, and 10 other knights lurk to try to catch Lancelot with Guinevere. They do catch him, and a fully armed knight, Sir Colgrevance, barges into the room to go after Lancelot. Despite being naked and unarmed, Lancelot kills Sir Colgrevance, steals his armor and weapons, and then heads out into the corridor to fight Agravain, Mordred, and the other 9 knights. Lancelot kills Agravain, all 9 of the other knights, and wounds Mordred, who only barely manages to escape. So, with that story in mind, would you say that Lancelot is someone who can quickly adapt, use what tools are on hand, and still manage to defeat his enemies? I would argue very much so. This is a great MP and skill for Lancelot to have, since it's an MP for Zerkerlot and a skill for Saberlot. Berserker Lancelot also has another MP, for Someone's Glory, that black fog or mist which completely obscures his identity. This too actually has a really solid link to Arthurian legend. Throughout the story, there are countless little tournaments and jousts where knights compete against each other for glory, honor, or just for the fun of it. Lancelot was quite fond of entering these tournaments, but he would dress up in nondescript armor to conceal his identity. Since he had such a fearsome reputation, this allowed him to enter tournaments without people getting intimidated upon seeing who they were up against. It also allowed Lancelot to sneak in and fight other Knights of the Round Table, something he did quite often. So while you might have thought that Lancelot's identity being obscured throughout most of Fate Zero was only for the sake of the plot, it does actually have a link to his legend. I approve. Saber Lancelot's craft essence is Lady of the Lake, featuring Lancelot standing upon the water of a lake. The Lady of the Lake, Vivienne, who may also be Morgan, is a character that appears many times in Arthurian legend, as the one who granted Arthur Excalibur, the jailer of Merlin, one of the people who took Arthur to Avalon, and so forth. Vivienne is also Lancelot's foster mother. So when you get to the CE's text and Lancelot saying everything began here, that is very much the truth in his case. This is where he grew up. As for the rest, it is Lancelot reflecting upon his life, the good times and bad times. But now, tired of all of it, he has come to this lake to rest, to cast aside everything and just rest. Now, Lancelot did despair after the Battle of Camelot, blaming himself for the fall of Camelot, choosing to cast everything away and become a monk during his final years. But, from my perspective, the CE's text makes it sound like Lancelot is about to kill himself, which he very much did not do. That makes my feelings regarding the CE rather complicated. On the one hand, it has clear links to his myth, both as an adopted son of the Lady of the Lake as well as his own regrets at the end of the story. But if suicide is the vibe they were going for, that's a bit of a problem. Berserker Lancelot's craft essence is Black Knight's helmet, featuring the helmet that Zerkerlot wears. This centers around his characterization in the Fate franchise, where his Berserker self is deeply remorseful of his actions in life. The CE's text elaborates on this, with Lancelot describing himself as only really capable of being a weapon, and that this helmet is the only remnant of the proud knight he once was. As I just mentioned when talking about Saberlot's Bond CE, Lancelot certainly had plenty of regrets at the end of his life. And since this CE lacks the suicidal tone of the other Bond CE, that makes this one much better. Saber Lancelot's Valentine CE is Blossom of Noble Hope, featuring an iris flower. What's this CE about? Well, flowers being given as gifts is certainly something you see in Arthurian legend, with Lancelot being on both the giving and receiving end. We even have paintings of this happening, specifically between Lancelot and Guinevere. So this being the gift that Lancelot gives you in return certainly makes sense for him. Though, as the CE's text says, maybe this is a little much? Considering who he would give flowers to in Arthurian legend, him giving this as a gift is maybe a little suggestive? No matter, it's still solid from a lore perspective. Berserker Lancelot's Valentine CE is Sword from Someone's Treasury, featuring a sword that is quite clearly not erendite. This is a reference to Fate Zero, when Lancelot would grab swords that Gilgamesh threw at him, then use them himself against Gilgamesh. In other words, this sword is one he took from Gilgamesh, and is now presenting to you. Obviously, this doesn't really have a link to Arthurian legend, but it still works, being similar to Bond CEs like Heracles' Castle of Snow, or Artoria's Crown of the Star that also reference story events in the franchise. And now for characterization, starting with a summary of the myth surrounding Lancelot. So, there's actually some debate as to where Lancelot originated from. His first appearance that we know of is the 12th century poem Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, by the French poet Chrétien de Troyes. If that name sounds familiar, this is the same guy who would later give us Percival and the Grail quest. The thing is, the way that de Troyes writes, it assumes that a reader is already familiar with the character, making it seem like Lancelot was already an established character in older works. But since those older works have been lost, we don't actually know the true origins of Lancelot. Is he from Welsh legends? Another earlier author? We don't know. What we do know is that Chrétien de Troyes' stories about Lancelot form the basis for the character we've known ever since. Now, there are a lot of stories involving Lancelot. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to try to stick to the main points in his life. But make no mistake, this guy does side quests like he's the protagonist in a Bethesda RPG. Lancelot is the son of King Ban of Benwick and Queen Elaine, and far from the last Elaine we will see in this story. Alas, Lancelot would not come to know his parents, since they would soon be forced to flee their last castle after it was captured. As Queen Elaine tended to the mortally wounded King Ban, the infant Lancelot was whisked away by the Lady of the Lake, where she raised the child in her own realm. After growing up in this magical realm in a very short span of time, Lancelot emerged in the real world once more. One thing though, Lancelot's name wasn't actually Lancelot, not originally at least. He was given the name du Lac upon leaving the Fey realm, which means of the lake. Later, when he learned who his real parents were, he took up the name of his grandfather, King Lancelot. But do you know what his real parents named him? Galahad. Yes, really. Before long, Lancelot found his way to Camelot, soon becoming one of the Knights of the Round Table. In Mallory, this happens just after Arthur's reign was secured, Merlin was gone, and the scabbard of Excalibur had been stolen by Morgan. But it was also just before this weird side story where King Arthur goes and conquers the Roman Empire, which then never comes up again afterwards. It is during those battles against Rome that Lancelot first distinguishes himself as a knight, proving his immense prowess in battle, and catapulting him into being regarded as among the best Round Table knights. This fame also gets him recognized by another, Queen Guinevere. Before long, Lancelot and Guinevere get into a relationship, one of the most famous in European literature, and which would ultimately have tragic consequences. I mentioned Lancelot appearing in the 12th century poems by Chrétien de Troyes before, and one thing about that? De Troyes' patron was the Countess Marie of Champagne. Apparently the Countess was really into romance, and so she asked de Troyes to write stories for her. In other words, the reason we get the love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere is because some rich countess wanted to read such things, and that small wish has led to over 800 years of creative works. Also, the Countess Marie was the first child of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who later became Queen of England and mother to, among others, Richard the Lionheart. Richard is in Fate's Strange Fake, though not yet in FGO. But I wonder if we will ever get Eleanor as a servant. She was kind of a big deal, too. Getting back into the story, what follows is a long litany of adventures, duels, and tournaments. Lancelot was quite fond of competing in jousts, and especially while hiding his identity so that he could fight his fellow Round Table knights. He also plays a notable role in introducing knights to the Round Table, including his nephew Bors, Tristan, and, of course, Gareth, whom Lancelot would knight personally. But he would also deal with some trouble with the opposite sex. Lancelot has what some might call single-target sexuality, meaning that he is only attracted to one person, Guinevere. But since Lancelot is considered handsome, courageous, and chivalrous, it probably won't come as a surprise that he had many admirers. Court maidens, at least a few queens, and, notably, Morgan Le Fay. Morgan's actions were motivated not just by an attraction to Lancelot, but also by her seething hatred for Guinevere, and so Morgan caused Lancelot trouble to try to hurt Guinevere by proxy. But no matter what, Lancelot always turned everyone down. Later on, after the Grail quest, another character, Elaine of Astolat, also known as the Lady of Shalott, would actually die of a broken heart due to being rejected by Lancelot, something that caused him no small amount of grief. Quick reminder that Elaine was the name of Lancelot's mother. But there was one person who wouldn't take no for an answer, a woman named Elaine of Corbenic. Yes, a third Elaine. But since Lancelot wasn't interested, Elaine decided to get her court enchantress to drug Lancelot with an aphrodisiac, use magic to make Elaine look like Guinevere, and so do the deed. When Lancelot awoke the following morning and discovered what happened, he was furious, with his code not to harm women probably being the only reason he didn't kill Elaine immediately. Instead, he rode off back to Camelot, wanting nothing to do with her ever again. But Elaine wasn't done with him. 10 years later, Elaine would show up at Camelot. Guinevere, who had learned what had happened before, decided to put Elaine in the room next to hers in order to keep an eye on Elaine. Late that night, Guinevere heard her name being called from the next door room, went to investigate, and discovered that Elaine had, again, gotten herself disguised as Guinevere so she could do Lancelot. Lancelot, upon seeing 2 Guineveres in his room, promptly lost his mind. Literally, he jumped out the window naked and lived in the woods for a few years. He would be gone for 5 years, first due to madness, and later due to embarrassment, until he was eventually found by Percival and convinced to return to Camelot. So yeah, it's just like what we saw with Uther and Igraine. What drove Elaine to do this? Well, lust certainly was a factor, but there was more to it than that. Elaine's father, King Pelles, also known as the Fisher King, was the keeper of the Holy Grail, and he had a prophecy that a child of Elaine and Lancelot would be the greatest knight to ever live, one worthy of acquiring the Grail. In other words, this is how we got Galahad. Needless to say, I will be picking this topic back up when it's time to talk about Lancelot in FGO. But getting back into Lancelot's story, Elaine assaulted Lancelot, did it again 10 years later, then Lancelot went insane for 5 years after that. And, after doing some complicated math, you will notice that it's been 15 years since that first incident, which means it's time for Lancelot to meet his son for the first time. I did a video on Galahad already, so you can watch that for more details on him and the Grail quest that follows. For his part, Lancelot, like all the other Knights of the Round Table, also sets out to look for the Holy Grail. But because of his many sins, above all his long-running affair with Guinevere, Lancelot would not be among the 3 Grail Knights. He did accompany Galahad for a time, where they had some quality bonding time together on a boat carrying a corpse. No, I'm not making that up. Before long, Galahad would depart, and Lancelot would return to Camelot. His experience during the Grail quest had made him think that he should end the affair, but that resolve died immediately upon seeing Guinevere once again. But that affair was no longer just catching the attention of outsiders like Morgan, but fellow Knights of the Round Table. Agravain and his half-brother Mordred hatched a plan to catch Lancelot and Guinevere in the act while King Arthur was away on a hunting trip, a plan agreed upon with the king. What follows is the incident I described when talking about Zerkerlot's MP. Agravain, Mordred, and 10 other knights catch Lancelot, only for Lancelot to kill all of them except Mordred, who only barely escapes. Though, one thing I didn't mention before, 2 of those 10 knights who had accompanied Agravain and Mordred were also sons of Gawain. Lancelot flees Camelot, but when he hears that Guinevere is to be put to death for treason, he returns. In a mad rampage, Lancelot charges forth, slaying anybody who crossed his path, until he was able to rescue Guinevere and escape. But in his rampage, Lancelot would kill not only another 24 Round Table knights who tried to bar his path, but 2 more brothers of Gawain, Gaheris and Gareth, neither of whom were armed, armored, or even wanting to be there. Despite the tragedy of Lancelot murdering Gareth, a knight who deeply looked up to Lancelot, this scene has also been used to inspire comedy. Going on a little tangent, despite me having done many videos on characters from Arthurian legend, I've only made 2 references so far to that most famous of parody films, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. For those of you who have seen that, you may recall a scene in that movie where Lancelot gets a letter from a nearby castle, supposedly from a princess who was about to be married against her will. Lancelot then takes up this righteous cause and charges forth, slaying and attacking anyone in his path until, at last, he reaches the captive princess, only to discover it's actually a captive prince. He is then confronted by the castle's lord, asking him why he just rampaged through and killed so many people, most of whom didn't even try to fight back, leaving Lancelot feeling quite embarrassed by the whole affair. This scene is, in effect, a comedic parody of Lancelot's rescue of Guinevere, and other moments where he flies off the handle and ends up killing lots of innocent people. In other words, Monty Python and the Holy Grail is more faithful to Arthurian legend than you might have thought, especially when it comes to its portrayal of Lancelot. Back on topic, Lancelot brought Guinevere to his castle, which was soon under siege by King Arthur's armies. Neither Arthur nor Lancelot were eager to fight each other, but Gawain, who had just had all 3 of his full brothers and 2 of his sons killed by Lancelot, he was understandably upset. Guinevere would be returned and Lancelot would then retreat to France, but Arthur and Gawain pursued. A few battles ensued, followed by 2 duels between Lancelot and Gawain. In these duels, Gawain very nearly overpowered Lancelot during the hours of 9 AM to noon, when Gawain's strength tripled. But once those hours were over, Lancelot was able to best Gawain, leaving him wounded but refusing to kill him. Before long, the news of Mordred's revolt led to King Arthur's army returning to Britain, leaving Lancelot in France. Not long after, Lancelot received a letter from Gawain, asking for forgiveness and to, above all, return to Britain to help King Arthur against Mordred. This letter had been written from Gawain's deathbed, having been fatally wounded in a battle against Mordred. Lancelot raced back to Britain as fast as he could, but he arrived too late. Guinevere would blame the fall of Camelot on their affair, deciding to become a nun and saying she never wished to see Lancelot again. In penance, Lancelot too would become a monk, as would Bedivere. Years later, he would learn that Guinevere was dying, but he would arrive less than an hour after she passed, fulfilling her wish to never see him again while she lived. Lancelot would perform the last rites for the queen he had once loved, with his own death following a few weeks later, and so passed the one once known as the greatest of the Round Table Knights. I know that was a good deal longer than my usual backstory sections, but hopefully all of you were okay with that. There are some things I didn't want to leave out, and others that are going to become very important to talk about shortly. We first meet Lancelot in Fate Zero, where he is the Berserker of the Fourth Holy Grail War. You don't actually know his real identity for most of the series, since it is obscured by his MP for Someone's Glory, which I talked about earlier. It is quickly made clear that Lancelot is an extremely dangerous combatant, able to fight well against not only Artoria, but Gilgamesh as well. All of us remember that awesome air battle between them. Still, even if those fights against Gilgamesh are very memorable, whenever Lancelot sees Artoria, he loses control and focuses exclusively upon her. Ultimately, it is revealed that Artoria choosing to forgive Lancelot is what drove him to madness, since he desired to be punished instead. I've got some issues with this. While it is true that Lancelot was riddled by guilt over betraying King Arthur by carrying out the affair with Guinevere, he never actually tried to attack King Arthur. Actually, it's the opposite of that. I mentioned that there were battles between Lancelot's forces and King Arthur. Well, what I didn't mention is that during one of those battles, Lancelot's nephew Sir Bors reached King Arthur and was moving to cut him down, only for Lancelot to stop him. Let me say that again. Lancelot prevented one of his own men from killing the enemy commander in the middle of a battle. A moment later, Gawain arrived and fought Bors, with them trading blows. I think this makes it quite clear how Lancelot felt about harming King Arthur. There's also the fact that once Gawain sent the letter begging for Lancelot to return, he immediately did so, though he sadly did not arrive in time. Also, as we already discussed, Lancelot's moments of madness predated the fall of Camelot. There is also a moment in Fate Zero where he makes use of his MP to disguise himself as Iskandar to abduct Irisfeel, which, yes, he can hide his own identity, but to make him look like someone else? That's a bit of a stretch. So when it comes to Lancelot in Fate Zero, it does a good job portraying him as a serious combatant, but it misses the mark with characterization. Moving into Fate Grand Order, Zirkelot does make a brief appearance in the Orleans Singularity, where he is one of John Alter's servants. And in a reversal of what Caster Gilles does in Fate Zero, he mistakes John d'Arc for Artoria, goes into a frenzy, and attacks John regardless of orders to fall back. As a result, he gets defeated, becoming one of the first of Jalter's servants to fall to Chaldea. Zirkelot got his main story appearance in Fate Zero, so rather than being a major character in FGO, it is his Saber version that moves onto the stage. Saberlot's first and most important story appearance is in the Camelot Singularity, where he serves as one of the knights fighting on the side of the Lion King, or Goddess Rongominiad. On another note, I can't be the only one who sees the name Lion King and thinks of the Disney movie, right? Anyway, Lancelot is chosen to help the king, but it soon becomes clear that he is less than enthusiastic about his orders. While Mordred and Gawain serve the Lion King largely to atone for past mistakes, and Tristan has his entire personality flipped because he couldn't do it otherwise, Lancelot quietly subverts the king's orders. He ends up rescuing people, quietly sending them to a secret camp that he himself calls a private army. While at first it seems like Lancelot's fight with Mash, or rather Galahad, is what ends up convincing him to switch sides, once he takes Chaldea to his camp, it's clear that Lancelot was already thinking of revolt. He just needed an extra push to actually go through with it. Much of Lancelot's rationale is that he believes that Agravain is pulling the strings, that the reason why the king is issuing such inhumane orders is because she is under Agravain's control. To be fair, Lancelot has reason to be wary of Agravain. He was the one who exposed the affair with Guinevere, effectively starting the fall of Camelot. And since Agravain was thought to be an agent of his mother Morgan, it makes sense that Lancelot would believe that only someone evil could give the orders that the Lion King was issuing. But that's not what's going on, and Lancelot's final confrontation with Agravain turns out very differently than he expected. The shock of this probably is why he ends up losing to Agravain, when otherwise, well, he did kill Agravain in Arthurian legend along with 11 other Round Table knights, and he did that by himself. And when one of those other knights was Mordred, who's not exactly a weakling. Agravain's fury at Lancelot's accusation, and how that caught Lancelot off guard is, I think, the only way Agravain managed to beat Lancelot. On that note, despite him still not being a full servant in FGO, I am seriously considering doing a video on Agravain, probably after the video on Tristan. It would pretty much only be about his characterization since he doesn't have a skill set, but Agravain is a character who has been taken in a pretty interesting direction compared to how he typically appears in Arthurian legend. Let me know if there's any interest in that. But now we need to talk about the elephant in the room, the topic I've been hinting at as far back as my video on Melusine 5 months ago, and that is Lancelot's relationship with Galahad. Or, more specifically, that infamous line in Camelot where Mash, or Galahad speaking through Mash, calls Lancelot a deadbeat dad. To put it bluntly, I think this is completely uncalled for. Now, was Lancelot a father to Galahad? Not really, no. They didn't even meet until Galahad was 15, and they only spent a little time together during the Grail quest. But Galahad's mother, Elaine of Corbenic, wasn't really apparent to him either. Galahad grew up in a monastery away from both of his parents and the whole outside world, which is probably why Galahad ended up being so inhuman, a person utterly devoid of personality outside of his convictions. But to call Lancelot a deadbeat, especially with the knowledge of how Galahad was conceived, that's disgusting. And if you are still not convinced, imagine if, in a franchise already well known for doing it, they had decided to gender flip Lancelot, and then called her a deadbeat mom. How would you react to that? There is one other issue with Lancelot's characterization, and that is that he has been given a reputation as a womanizer. You see it in Camelot when he decides to save Da Vinci, with others suggesting that this is why he did it. Now, you could argue that Lancelot was just following his code, which would be consistent with his legend. But then, in later event appearances like Summer 4, it's made clear that Lancelot being depicted as a womanizer wasn't just a one-time thing. I've already mentioned how Lancelot was solely focused upon Guinevere, even when so many others expressed interest in him. If I had to guess, I'd say that the creators mixed up Lancelot with Gawain, and even then Gawain was only a womanizer in some of the stories. But speaking of Summer 4, that event didn't just give us Lancelot enjoying the attentions of those he was dealing cards to. It also gave us that scene where Moriarty brutally exploits Lancelot's guilt about killing Gareth. A bit heavy for a summer event, but it was more in keeping with Lancelot's character than the other stuff he was doing. Overall, I'd say that Lancelot's characterization is flawed. It does do some things well, but then goes completely contrary to his character in others. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Lancelot's depiction in Fate Grand Order in the wider Fate franchise? Well, his character design and skill set are excellent, full of references to the character from Arthurian legend. Really, it's only Saberlot's Bond CE that I have a beef with, making it sound like Lancelot was suicidal and perhaps even could have ended his own life. But when it comes to characterization, there are some real problems. He is depicted as a very formidable warrior, and he clearly does have a good side to his personality, well, with how he objected to the Lion King's actions on moral grounds, while many of his fellow knights carried out atrocities. But his Berserker form's murderous rage towards Artoria, someone he protected even when they were fighting against each other, or portraying Lancelot as a womanizer when the only person he was ever interested in was Guinevere, that is completely contrary to Arthurian legend. As for the whole Deadbeat Dad thing, even if Lancelot wasn't a proper father to Galahad, that's just cruel in the light of how Galahad was conceived. It's completely out of character for MASH to be that mean. Galahad, well, actually he might say something like that. Remember, this is the guy who in Moonlight Lostroom basically said defeating Gatia was the wrong thing to do, despite, helping us do it. Any self-reflection there, Galahad, while you're standing there judging everyone? No? I didn't think so. The way Lancelot is in FGO, it actually reminds me of Blackbeard. His skill set is superb from a lore perspective, but characterization lets him down. Lancelot deserves better. And so for a final grade, I am going to give Lancelot, the Knight of the Lake, a D. If you would like to learn more about Lancelot's obnoxious son, and the much better person his spirit inhabits, check out my video on Galahad here. Until next time.